You know, if you've been paying attention to the news lately, specifically the hostilities in the Middle East, it's easy to just focus on oil.
Right, that's the obvious one.
Yeah. But in just over a week, global farmers are suddenly paying 20% more for a commodity that is, arguably way more vital to human survival than gasoline.
Oh, absolutely. We are talking about fertilizer here.
Exactly, fertilizer.
Mhm.
And it's a spike that is quietly setting the stage to make your grocery bill, significantly more expensive in the coming months.
A 20% jump in just a matter of days is a massive shock to any global system. But when it hits the fundamental layer of agricultural production, the ripple effects are profound.
Yeah, it's wild.
To understand the current fragility of our food supply, we actually have to, divert our attention away from the farms and look directly at the global energy sector.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for today's deep dive is to trace that exact thread. We want to show you how a geopolitical conflict thousands of miles away basically dictates the price of your bread and pasta.
It really does.
And we are drawing from some incredibly detailed analysis published recently by Kulti on Patreon.
Right. The piece titled, The War in Iran is Already Impacting Food Production Due to Soaring Fertilizer Prices.
Catchy title, but very to the point.
Yeah.
And the main character in this whole chain reaction they lay out is a substance called urea.
Yeah, synthesized urea, which is the single most widely used nitrogen fertilizer in the entire world.
Basically the bedrock.
It is the absolute bedrock of modern high-yield agriculture. Without it, the global food system simply could not support our current population.
And right now, the price of that bedrock is surging. So the analysis points out that if we look at the Egyptian market, which is what the industry uses as the global benchmark for March deliveries, a ton of urea recently crossed the $585 mark.
Which is roughly 570 euros.
Right, 570 euros. And that represents the largest single weekly price increase we've seen since the initial shock of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
It's a staggering jump. And to grasp why a conflict in the Middle East is causing a fertilizer benchmark in Egypt to spike so violently, we have to look closely at how urea is actually manufactured.
Right, because you don't just mine it out of the ground like a rock.
No, not at all. Most commercial fertilizers are created by extracting nitrogen directly from the air we breathe.
Which, it sounds simple enough on paper, right? Given that the atmosphere is mostly nitrogen anyway?
It sounds simple, but the chemical reality is much more stubborn.
Yeah. So think of it this way. Think of atmospheric nitrogen like a massive steel vault holding the nutrients that your crops desperately need. The nitrogen atoms are bound together by this incredibly strong triple bond.
Exactly. Plants can't break that bond on their own.
They just can't. So natural gas isn't just an ingredient in the recipe here. Think of natural gas as the flour used to bake the bread or fertilizer. Or actually, maybe it's better to say it's the dynamite required to blow that steel vault open.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the Haber-Bosch process. Pulling that nitrogen out of the atmosphere and converting it into a usable agricultural, specifically ammonia, which is then turned into urea, requires immense amounts of heat and pressure.
Right, and where does that heat come from?
Natural gas. It serves a dual purpose. It provides the fuel to generate that extreme heat, and it provides the hydrogen molecules necessary to actually bond with the nitrogen.
Wow.
Yeah. And because of this incredibly intensive process, the International Energy Agency estimates that fuel represents more than 70% of the total production cost of urea.
Over 70%. That's huge.
Right, that's massive.
So it's essentially an energy product in disguise.
Yeah.
You're basically buying natural gas that's been transformed into a solid state.
That's exactly what it is. And that deep dependency is why the sharp rise in fertilizer prices is moving in absolute lockstep with the price of natural gas.
Which has recently doubled in Europe, right?
Yes, doubled. And Professor Jose Maria Garcia, who's an economics expert at the Polytechnic University of Valencia, he recently confirmed this exact mechanism in the source material. The surging cost of natural gas is the absolute primary driver for that 20% spike in the cost of fertilizer.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate for a second. Or rather, let me ask what I'm sure you were thinking right now.
Sure.
If the underlying cost of production is skyrocketing right now, and global producers are paying 20% more today, there's an obvious disconnect for anyone walking into a supermarket.
Right, the prices on the shelves.
Yeah. I was just at the store yesterday, and a box of pasta or a loaf of bread costs exactly what it did a month ago.
Yeah.
So why hasn't that massive cost increase hit the consumer yet?
Well, it comes down to a delay mechanism that's basically built into the agricultural calendar. What's happening in the commodity markets today doesn't immediately alter the price tags on the shelves tomorrow.
Oh, because of reserves.
Exactly. The farmers who are planting their fields right now are mostly using fertilizer reserves that they purchased and secured through contracts months ago.
Ah, so well before these specific hostilities broke out.
Right. Those historical reserves have temporarily insulated the consumer from the immediate shock.
So farmers are essentially surviving on last season's planning.
Yes, but the clock is ticking. The moment they have to buy next month's urea, they are hitting a brick wall.
And the analysis points out that the crops with the highest fertilizer demand are going to be the first to force these new exorbitant costs onto you, the consumer.
We're talking about heavy nitrogen consumers like cereals and sunflowers.
Which translates directly to the price of your bread, your pasta, your sunflower oil.
Yeah, exactly. And the agricultural associations tracking this data note that the impact on consumers might be brief, but, and this is a big but, that is entirely contingent on the conflict resolving within a matter of weeks.
Right, allowing energy markets to cool down before the next major purchasing cycle.
Exactly.
And the likelihood of a rapid resolution brings us to the specific geographical reality of this crisis. When we talk about global fertilizer exports, the Gulf region is the undeniable center of gravity.
It really is. Nearly a third of all global fertilizer exports originate in this specific area.
Primarily from Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, right?
Right. And that geographic concentration of production is inherently risky even during peacetime. But the recent disruptions highlight how quickly a highly optimized system like this can just completely unravel.
Yet we are looking at a cascading series of incidents that have effectively crippled major export hubs. Like, let's look at Qatar specifically.
Okay.
The world's leading producer there had to completely halt production at its largest export plant recently
Why?
because it was targeted by an Iranian drone attack.
Right. A physical strike on infrastructure immediately took that capacity offline.
Just boom, gone.
And the disruption gets much more complex when you look at the corporate web of the energy sector. There is a separate massive gas processing plant that was physically seized by Iran.
Okay, so a seized plant. But wait, that plant doesn't make fertilizer, does it?
No, it doesn't, and that's the critical detail here. This seized plant doesn't produce fertilizer itself. It processes and supplies the raw gas to a completely different Qatari company.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and that downstream company relies entirely on that gas to manufacture urea. And get this, they're single-handedly responsible for nearly 10% of all global urea exports.
Wait, 10% from one company?
It's just one company.
So because the upstream gas supply was seized, the downstream fertilizer production is just completely shut down.
Exactly. 10% of the global supply of the world's most critical agricultural input was just wiped off the board in an instant.
Right.
Not because their plant was hit, but because their fuel line was cut.
Wow.
What's fascinating here is that the physical fragility of global trade is on full display. We often conceptualize international commerce as this abstract, seamless, digital network of contracts and futures.
Right, numbers on a screen.
Yeah, but ultimately, it requires moving highly volatile physical materials through specific physical spaces. And in this region, all of that commerce has to pass through the Strait of Hormuz.
And the geography of the Strait of Hormuz is what makes this situation so precarious. It's a waterway sitting between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. And at its narrowest point, it is just 34 kilometers wide.
It's tiny.
For perspective, you could drive across that distance on a highway in about 20 minutes. Yet through that tiny 34-kilometer choke point flows a staggering percentage of the energy and agricultural inputs that keep the modern world functioning.
And currently, that flow is severely restricted. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard has imposed a partial blockade, deliberately strangling these shipping routes.
Which creates a massive logistical backlog. I mean, recent reports indicate that there are more than 3,000 commercial vessels stranded on both sides of the strait.
3,000?
3,000 massive cargo ships, fully loaded with the gas and fertilizer the global agricultural sector desperately needs, just essentially parked in the ocean.
The logistical nightmare of that is difficult to overstate. You have crews sitting idle. You have insurance premiums for those vessels skyrocketing simply because they're in a conflict zone.
Oh, the insurance must be insane.
It's astronomical. And demurrage costs, basically late fees for the ships, are piling up by the hour.
And the longer those ships sit, the more the global market reacts.
Definitely.
So to trace how a maritime traffic jam in the Middle East actually reaches your local economy, we have to track the intended destinations of that stranded cargo.
Right, where was it supposed to go?
According to data from the International Trade Center, The fertilizers passing through that specific bottleneck are predominantly destined for the Middle East, India, and Turkey.
But crucial amounts are also destined for the United States and Brazil.
Ah, yes.
And that detail is the linchpin for the global price spike, because the U.S. and Brazil are absolute titans of global agricultural production.
They operate on a scale that dictates global food prices.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, when agricultural giants like the United States and Brazil suddenly realize their critical fertilizer shipments are trapped behind an Iranian blockade, their domestic agricultural sectors face an existential threat.
They can't exactly just skip a planting season.
No, you can't pause farming. So instead, they leverage their massive capital to pivot. They scour the rest of the globe for new, reliable suppliers.
So they enter the spot market and aggressively buy up whatever's available.
Yep. And this frantic search for alternative supplies by massive American and Asian economies ends up indirectly squeezing the entire global market.
So everyone is suddenly fighting over a rapidly shrinking pie.
Exactly. The Spanish Association of Fertilizer Manufacturers recently released a statement confirming this dynamic. They noted that the extreme imbalance between global supply and demand is driving up prices everywhere, particularly for urea.
And the countries that feel this price hike the most acutely are those with massive agricultural sectors that lack their own domestic fertilizer manufacturing capacity, right?
Precisely. They are entirely exposed to the volatility of the open market.
And Europe is a prime example of this vulnerability. The recent analysis we're looking at highlights Spain as a case study.
Spain is a great example.
Yeah, Spain has a massive, highly productive agricultural sector, but they are critically dependent on foreign imports for the inputs required to run it. Industry representatives point out that the urea used by Spanish producers is almost entirely manufactured outside their borders.
Right. Estimates from the National Association of Fertilizer Manufacturers show that Spain's domestic market relies on imports for 60% of its needs.
But wait, hold on. Isn't the entire point of the European Union's internal market to prevent exactly this kind of external reliance?
You would think so, yeah.
Like, why can't a country like Spain simply shift their purchasing to internal EU producers like Belgium or France?
It's a logical assumption. And to be fair, there is significant internal trade within the bloc. Countries like France and Belgium do act as major mixing and distribution hubs for the rest of the EU. However, if you zoom out and look at the raw data from Eurostat, the structural vulnerability becomes glaringly obvious. The EU as a whole is not self-sufficient. They rely heavily on North Africa for the foundational materials. Morocco, Egypt, and Algeria account for nearly 36% of all EU fertilizer imports.
So internal suppliers like Belgium are effectively middlemen.
Exactly. They might process or distribute the fertilizer, but the underlying raw materials or the finished urea itself are still coming from across the Mediterranean.
Oh, wow. So when the U.S. and Brazil start panic buying because the Gulf is blockaded, they look directly at North Africa to fill their deficits.
Right. And European buyers are suddenly forced into a bidding war against agricultural superpowers just to maintain their traditional supply lines from Egypt and Morocco.
That's a bidding war they really don't want to be in.
No. And the competition for that North African supply is even more intense right now because Europe's secondary supply line is severely compromised.
You mean Russia?
Yes. Despite the geopolitical tensions of the last few years, Russia still maintains a 22% market share of European fertilizer imports.
Which means European supply lines aren't starting from a healthy, stable baseline to begin with. They're already strained from the ongoing fallout of the war in Ukraine.
Exactly. And those Russian imports are now subject to a 6% tariff imposed by the EU.
So the baseline price of available fertilizer for a European farmer was already artificially inflated before a single drone ever struck a facility in Qatar.
You've got it. European producers are completely backed into a corner right now.
The supply from the Gulf is choking behind a blockade. The North African markets are seeing immense bidding pressure from global heavyweights, and the Russian supply carries a heavy tariff.
It's a perfect storm, and the director of the Young Farmers Association in Brussels recently issued a stark warning about this exact confluence of events.
What did he say?
He stated that the situation is already serious and could actually worsen compared to the initial agricultural shock we experienced during the outbreak of the war in Ukraine.
Man, to hear industry leadership compare the current trajectory to the shock of the Ukraine war, that really underscores the severity of these compounding crises.
It's alarming. Farmers are facing operational cost increases that are just impossible to absorb internally. The data indicates that some European producers have been forced to pay more than 600 euros per ton in recent days just to secure the urea they need to plant their crops.
600 euros. From a historical baseline of perhaps 300 or 400 euros a ton.
Yeah, that kind of jump completely destroys a farm's profit margin.
And that cost simply has to be passed on.
Yeah.
It travels mechanically down the supply chain, from the spiked cost of the natural gas well, to the fertilizer synthesis plant, to the heavily insured cargo ship idling in the strait, to the farmer's cooperative, and finally to the checkout aisle at your local supermarket.
It is a stark demonstration of how deeply interconnected our daily survival is to global energy markets and geopolitical stability. The illusion of a localized food system where you just interact with the grocery store and maybe the farm down the road is entirely dependent on an invisible, highly fragile global network functioning perfectly.
So what does this all mean? If we trace the entire thread we've unpacked today, a targeted drone strike and a partial maritime blockade in a 34-kilometer stretch of water halfway across the world has stranded 3,000 massive cargo ships.
Right.
That logistical paralysis immediately spikes the price of natural gas in global markets, which inherently drives up the production cost of synthesized urea.
Yeah.
That sudden supply shortage forces agricultural superpowers into a frantic bidding war, squeezing an already tariff-strained European market, which ultimately guarantees that the price of the bread, the pasta, and the cooking oil in your pantry is going to rise.
That is the exact chain of events.
You are interacting with the Strait of Hormuz, Qatari energy infrastructure, and European tariff policy, all disguised as a simple box of cereal.
It's incredible to think about it that way. And as we conclude this analysis, there is one final staggering data point from the source material that we really need to consider.
Okay, let's hear it.
So we have spent this entire deep dive mapping out the immense geopolitical risk, the skyrocketing financial costs, and the incredible energy expenditures required to synthesize, ship, and secure this fertilizer, right?
Right. It's clearly a massive high-stakes operation.
Well, agricultural data shows that 70% of the fertilizers applied globally end up as agricultural waste.
Wait, 70%? You mean it isn't even absorbed by the crops?
No, 70% of it just washes away as runoff
Yeah.
into our air, our aquifers, and our surface waters.
That is an almost incomprehensible systemic inefficiency.
It really is. We're mobilizing navies, risking global trade wars, and driving up the cost of basic human sustenance to secure a resource where more than 2/3 of it is literally flushed into the environment. So perhaps the most vital takeaway here isn't just about how quickly military forces can clear a maritime blockade or how fast supply chains can reroute around a conflict zone.
Right.
It raises a fundamental question about systemic design. If our global food security is entirely dependent on a physical system this fragile and an application process this wildly inefficient, isn't it time we fundamentally reimagine how we grow our food rather than just panicking about the geopolitics of where the chemicals come from?
It makes you look at the entire agricultural paradigm differently.
Yeah.
The true vulnerability might not just be the geopolitical choke points, but the underlying mechanics of the system itself.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Next time you're in the supermarket picking up a loaf of bread, keep questioning the hidden connections in the world around you. We'll catch you on the next one.